ING is something, really unique in terms of what it's doing. It's something which is probably one of the only such organizations in London, creating communication between the building industry. So tell us a little bit more about what you do and how it came about. And you're the founder, so also tell us about your crazy journey about how you conceived it. Let's start with how you conceived it and how it reached where you are today.
Okay. Well, first of all, ING is actually INGMedia, and that was interesting in itself because I founded in 1999, and that was at the beginning of the .com boom. And finding a name which had a URL, a website address, which was a new thing in those days, as well as being able to match a company's house, was very difficult. So after searching through loads of names that were all taken, I founded on the idea of INGMedia, which means we're active. We're doing people. We're very active. We're pitching. We're writing. We're coming up with ideas. So that's what that was all about. But my background was very broad in terms of PR and communications. But we started working with architects. And I was introduced to this amazing world of what we call the built environment.
Why architects? How did you get introduced to the building industry?
Well, through my ex-partner, we had he is an architectural photographer, and so he introduced me to a lot of architects that he was working with. And I thought that architects were unbelievably talented and did amazing work, but they communicated in a very different style to what I was used to. And I thought I could help them, and there was an opportunity there to work with them to improve how they communicated and how they won new work. And by work, very quickly, we developed a very large list of clients, architecture clients on our roster, and we started to work with their clients who were either developers or cultural institutions. And I started going to an event which is held in Cannes every year in March called MIPIM. And that was really interesting for me because it was the first time I really got to see the entire ecosystem of how buildings and how the things in our landscape come about, what happens in what we call the built environment. So how do you get money to finance your project, who decides, who chooses the architect, who influences that decision, local authorities who are making big decisions about strategic parcels of land. And so that's how we developed. And what I found at that stage is that there were a number of excellent agencies who worked in different sections of this world. So there might be someone you went to who knew about PR for financing and sort of the money side, and then there were other people who were much more cultural or artistic, but nobody was bringing them all together. And yet all together, that's how they exist. If you go to a project meeting for a major building, the line. So we realised that there was something unique in being able to be a turnkey solution for this industry. And since we made that decision and have focused on that strategy, the business has grown significantly. Now we have 40 people based here in our London office in Shoreditch. And we work with clients all over the world, and it's fantastic. It's intellectually stimulating. We love it. You can see the effects of your work every time you walk around London or any other city. You get a sense of pride in the projects you've been involved with.
So tell us about a typical project. Like, what do you do? What do you really do in that project?
I think that's a really good point. So I'll use an example from a couple of years ago where we worked with an amazing architecture practice called ALA, and they were the architects on a new cultural building in Lisbon called the MAT Museum, M-A-A-T. And for us, that was an opportunity to bring all of our skills together, because here you had a museum, which is a cultural institution, but it had such a significant impact on the people of Lisbon. You know, it was on the waterfront. It was beautifully designed by our client, and it had buy-in from the mayor's office, the prime minister, every level of society. And I think they had something like 80,000 people turned up on the first weekend to see this new museum. And you may have seen it on Instagram and used all over the world. The images are used all over the world. And so what we did is we worked with the architect to obviously promote their work, but also became a very important liaison with the museum staff, the city, and all sorts of the different cultural institutions. So that's a good example of a project.
So can you go a little granular into what you did with the staff or what you did with individual? How did you improve the communication?
Well, I think it's so first of all the information. How do you make the information about a building as user-friendly to as broad range of people, a group of people as possible? So you have architecture writers who are sometimes very technical and very specific and hugely knowledgeable about their subject, and then you have the person in the street who just wants to go along and understand the motivations of the architect and how it was designed a certain way, without necessarily understanding all the detail. They don't want that level of detail. So our role was to work with the architect and the museum in making sure all of the materials were very useful and user-friendly, making sure that the content, as you know, content is king. So videos, short films, photography was all there at the disposal of the people that needed to use it, making sure all of the architects were able to talk to literally hundreds of journalists who came to see this museum. So that was our role. And again, as you probably know, like most things in PR, there's a lot administratively to manage, just making place, getting their interviews, especially when in a high demand situation.
So how do you think this kind of a business differs from regular PR? How do you think it's different?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I've always, before I got into this sector, I was always a great believer that you could transfer from any sector to another. And I think it's much more difficult in our sector unless you have a passion for the topic. Because you have to have a level of knowledge and a level of curiosity so you can talk to all the different groups in their own language. So an architect is incredibly busy. They're looking after their business, they're looking after their clients, they're obviously creatives in their own sense. So they need to have PR professionals who can talk their language. They don't want to necessarily, they don't have the time to educate a PR person about the language they need to use. And also there are a lot of issues with architects around their peer group trust, and it's really important that their PR professionals.
What kind of issues?
Well, it's about, if you're it's like being I guess if you're a scientist, the person on the street will understand what you're trying to do, but your own peers will be much more not so much critical but much more knowledgeable. So you have to make sure that you're presenting yourself correctly to that group so that they have a trust and a respect for what you do. And that also impacts on those architects in terms of recruitment. So they want to be respected for the quality of their work, their thinking, their intellectual rigor. So we as PR professionals have to be sensitive to those issues.
Do you think you make architecture, the professional architecture, sexy with better PR?
I think so. I would hope so. I don't know that sexy is the right word. I think more accessible is what we like to believe in. And I think that we've only just scratched the surface. I think the average person still doesn't understand necessarily what a huge impact, not just architecture, but the whole built environment has on their lives. I mean, you were talking when you arrived today about coming on the tube and the challenges that you had. Now, when things go right in terms of transport, that can improve your day in an incredible way. It can have a massive impact on your quality of life. But I don't think we as consumers or we as people living in a city necessarily think that way. So at the moment, Crossrail is a massive project that is happening underneath London, where a new tube line will take people from west to east or east to west across London. Now that's been 20 years in the making, and it's incredibly heroic. I mean, you've got people who are unbelievably skilled at what they do, who have spent the last 20 years preparing, designing, constructing this amazing project, which when it opens will change the lives of people and their daily commute. The built environment sexy, but I would love to be able to eventually say that we've raised awareness of the impact it has.
Do you think buildings in London are more controversial than probably anywhere in the world? I mean, every major building that has been conceived and built, it has its share of controversies, whether it be the Shard, whether it be the performing, the oval, what they
Yes, the Globe.
The Globe.
The Globe. Well, it's interesting. I was just in Washington last week for a conference with the Urban Land Institute, and the US has exactly the same issues. I mean, I think that as a population, we're kind of negative towards change. So it doesn't matter if it's a large building or, frankly, your neighbour wants to put an extension on their house. Generally, our default position is we don't want that. So all projects come with controversy. It goes hand in hand, no matter how big or small. But I think ultimately they knit into the fabric. Now, I have my personal views about what I like and what I don't like, but that's not our role. Our role is to help the client deal with their communications.
And how do you think this? Do you think the new focus on environment is impacting building communications? Because there's a huge, whether it is compliant, whether it is recycled, the energy that is used, and the level of energy and the impact on the environment. Do you think that's you've seen that in your profession?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, to be fair to the profession, and what a lot of people don't realise is they've been dealing with this for a long time. They've been aware of this issue. And what has happened with a lot of buildings, and I don't know if this is the case in India, but we talk a lot about retrofit or repurposing buildings. So a lot of buildings, office buildings in particular, that perhaps were built in the 60s or 70s, were not built with the technology built into them like they are now. So a lot of buildings are having to have that refitted, and engineers and architects have been working very hard for many years to do that in the most efficient way. Now, obviously some are better than others, but this is not a new journey for our sector. I think that definitely it's a number one priority. And I think people are realising that it's more and more important because the public focus is on it now. But it would be wrong to say that this is a new thing for our industry. There are some very, very bright people who've been working on this for a very long time.
Great.